In 2008, the year that possibly the biggest ever collapse of the global economy began to be noticed, the President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, appointed an international commission of economic experts to examine the very foundation stones of economics, its key measurement tools. Given that economics had very obviously just catastrophically failed the vast majority of people in the Western world, Sarkozy assembled together over 20 economics experts, including Jean-Paul Fitoussi, president of the Center for Economic Research in Paris, and two Nobel laureates in economics, Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen. 2 years later, Sarkozy's International Commission produced a report of their findings titled Mismeasuring Our Lives. The Commission concentrated much of its efforts on one particular key measurement tool, gross domestic product, or GDP. According to the capitalist model that controls the world's economy, GDP, which is supposedly the monetary value of the goods and services produced by a country, is possibly the most significant single indicator there is about a country's economic performance. As is clear from the title of the Commission's report, Mismeasuring Our Lives, they found that this vitally important key economic indicator, GDP, is, as far as we're the 99% are concerned, quite meaningless. Although GDP is fairly helpful to the 1% who want to manage the world like it's their own private business enterprise, it's completely useless to the 99% who value other things above dollars and cents, such as personal health and happiness and the long-term health and sustainability of our life-sustaining planet. Unfortunately, most of us, the 99%, automatically glaze over at the very mention of the word economics, which is exactly what the 1% want us to do, of course. That's why they don't bother teaching it in any meaningful way in most schools, and that's why the subject is never widely discussed in any meaningful way in the mainstream media. Economics is vitally important to our lives and needs to be far more widely understood than it is. And that's especially important, and what's especially important to understand is, just as Sarkozy's commission indicated, how economics is mismeasured and the cynical reasons for that mismeasurement. Apart from some brief critiques on popular economic theory, I'll not waste much time in this talk on conventional economics. There's really a zillion books that already do that. Instead, I'll be discussing the subject as more of a philosophical topic and conclude with one possible solution to the very real economic problems our world is facing, an economic model I call ENMO. But I'll explain more about that later on. I've just said I'll not waste much time talking about conventional economics. This is because conventional economics is not only completely useless as far as we, the 99%, are concerned, it's also downright evil and directly responsible for much of the planet's misery. To most ears, that would seem a preposterous statement, heretical even, but I'm far from being on my own in believing it. We could go back as far as Adam Smith, who, almost 250 years ago, pioneered much of what now appears as modern economic theory. Smith knew about the long-standing cynicism of the mighty rulers who have always blighted the lives of the 99%, for he wrote the following: "All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind." In Adam Smith's day, the major European nations were all frantically competing with each other in a global looting spree that would come to be praised in countless history classes as colonialism. Although the following observation by Smith referred to the Spanish Empire, there was nothing much to choose between any of the European powers in how they went about plundering their planet. The Council of Castile, wrote Smith in his Superb Wealth of Nations, determined to take possession of countries of which the inhabitants were plainly incapable of defending themselves. The pious purpose of converting them to Christianity sanctified the injustice of the project. The point about selling the plundering of other nations as somehow beneficial to those nations, a pious purpose, was definitely not an original notion by the Spanish, as the Crusaders could have confirmed hundreds of years earlier. In Smith's day, Britain's own East India Company was flexing its imperial muscles, and he quite probably had that fact in mind when he gave the following general warning about the political power of big business. "The government of an exclusive company of merchants," he wrote, "is perhaps the worst of all governments for any country whatever." When I was at school, some 200 years after the publication of Smith's famous book, It was still being taught in economics classes as the father of that pseudo-science. However, his work had been carefully cherry-picked. For most of his working life, Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University. The ethics and morality that comes through in much of his work had been quietly forgotten. Elements of interest to the world of big business, such as economies of scale and the important notion that labour is just another business cost, were selected instead as far more appropriate lessons for the schoolroom, together with that infamous and much overemphasised invisible hand statement, commonly used to suggest a godly approval of the philosophy that had been named capitalism. I think if Smith knew how his great book would be violated by later generations, he would never have written it. But Adam Smith was far from being the only well-known voice to sound the alarm bells about the rising power of big business. 100 years later, US President Abraham Lincoln noticed it too and issued the following warning. "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will surely follow." Less than 100 years later, Roosevelt expressed a similar alarm. "The liberty of a democracy," he said, "is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism, ownership of a government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power." And within 3 decades of that warning, yet another American president, Eisenhower this time, echoed similar concerns in his farewell address to the nation in 1961. He spoke about the intrusion of big business into politics. In the first known use of the expression military-industrial complex, Eisenhower said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." In the foreword to the report commissioned in 2008 by Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president wrote about the fact that mismeasurements used by economists are known to be defective. Sarkozy said this, "There has indeed been a long-standing problem with what we calculate and the way we use what we find. The experts have been aware of this for a long time, and they've been discussing it for a long time. But this discussion didn't change anything. It made no impact." The Australian professor of economics, Steve Keen, is one of the few voices to speak out loudly on this very point. In fact, Keen wrote a whole book on this subject, titled Debunking Economics. Here he offers an explanation for the point made by Sarkozy that in spite of the fact that so many experts have long known about the uselessness of economics, no changes were made to the Western economic model. "Economic theory has seen off many attacks," says Keen, "not because it is strong enough to withstand them, but because it is strong enough to ignore them. Part of that strength has come from the irrelevance of economics. You don't need an accurate theory of economics to build an economy in the same sense that you need an accurate theory of propulsion to build a rocket." Note that phrase, the irrelevance of economics. This from a university professor who has taught economics for over 30 years. Keen goes on to say that there is one striking fact about this whole literature of economics, and that is that there is not one single empirical fact in it. The complete irrelevance of the apparent theoretical base underpinning Western economic theory is obviously bad enough, but is far from being the full extent of the problem. In fact, it's only a small part of it. In 2013, the superb journalist Matt Taibbi wrote an article for Rolling Stone magazine titled "Everything is Rigged." That piece, together with many others that he's written on this theme, reveals with a shocking clarity that anyone can understand that the entire multi-trillion-dollar financial services industry is entirely fraudulent from top to bottom. It's like the biggest ever casino the world has ever known, and the biggest ever rigged casino at that. Part of the fraud that Taibbi referred to made it, briefly and very superficially, into the mainstream news. You may recall it, the so-called LIBOR scandal, which revealed that some of the biggest banks in the Western world had been colluding to rig the interest rates they set. Well, it turned out that, huge though this fraud was, involving many hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly trillions, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Further revelation suggested that other key indices were also rigged, which, taken together, made the LIBOR fraud look almost like a minor shoplifting offence. There was something called ISDAFIX, a benchmark for setting the price of interest rate swaps that had been rigged, together with a multi-billion-dollar market in precious metals and the foreign exchange market. In fact, when one comes to understand a little about proprietary trading and high-frequency trading, it becomes very clear that the whole stock market is basically a rigged game, where huge profits are made for insiders, and insiders only. Lou Gutman, who was once chairman of NYMEX, the New York Commodities Futures Exchange, and who therefore knew what he was talking about, said this: NYMEX management pretty much spent a year and a half trying not to run a business. Everything they were doing was to keep the shareholders barefoot and pregnant and do a deal, take the money and run off to a sunshine state. At the beginning of this talk, I said that conventional economics is not only completely useless as far as we the 99% are concerned, it's also downright evil and directly responsible for much of the planet's misery. I've now tried to sketch a brief outline for why I believe this is true, from the days of Adam Smith over 200 years ago, through 3 American presidents and 1 French one. And using the words of experts in the fields of economics and financial services, I've presented a very brief case demonstrating that the Western economic system is not fit for purpose and must be changed. There are many other, even more damning proofs for this claim than those I've mentioned. I haven't spoken about the evils of trade sanctions, for example, which have long been used as a weapon of war, nor have I mentioned how our planet's fragile environment is being trashed in the name of corporate profit to such an extent that species are being made extinct at a faster rate now than the extinction that was wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Although I've shown through the work of Stiglitz, Sen and Fitoussi that GDP, arguably the most important of all economic indicators, is in fact mismeasured, I haven't shown how other vitally important economic measurements, such as unemployment and the rate of inflation, are deliberately manipulated by our trusted leaders for deeply cynical reasons. There are all these factors and many more besides that justify my case. On the other hand, what is there to justify the course of the kleptocrats, the people who impose their evil economic system on us? In a word, nothing, except the fact that it's a system that best protects their interests, the interests of the 1%. As far as these people are concerned, the very different needs of the 99%, together with the long-term health of our planet, are completely irrelevant. No doubt the 1% would wheel out their infamous Tina argument. We must endure what they call capitalism because there is no alternative. That is, of course, a lie. There are many alternatives, there are as many alternatives as there are people to imagine them. Steve Keen put it like this: the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which ramify for those of us brought up, as most of us have been, into every corner of our minds. In the next part of this talk, I'll be discussing one such new idea: Enmo economics.